The gavel came down with a sharp crack that echoed through the packed community center. Every seat was filled. Every eye was on me. The HOA president, Margaret, sat frozen at the head table, her face drained of all color. Her mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air, but no words came out. I stood up slowly, savoring every second of this moment. The manila folder in my hands contained the documents that would change everything. 3 years of harassment, 3 years of fines, 3 years of watching them destroy my American dream, one violation notice at a time. "Ladies and gentlemen," I said, my voice steady despite my racing heart, "I have an announcement that I think you will all find very interesting." Margaret finally found her voice. "This is highly irregular. You cannot just—" I smiled and opened the folder. "Actually, Margaret, I can do whatever I want. You see, as of yesterday at 3 p.m., I became the legal owner of all the common areas in this neighborhood, including the pool you have been using every single day for the past 5 years." The room erupted. Some people cheered, others gasped. Margaret looked like she was about to faint. That is when I realized that sometimes the best revenge is not just getting even. Sometimes it is taking everything they thought they owned and making it yours. My name is David, and I have been living the American dream for the past 8 years. Well, I thought I was living it anyway. I bought my house in Maple Ridge Estates back in 2016. It was a beautiful 3-bedroom colonial on a quiet street lined with oak trees. The neighborhood felt perfect. Kids rode bikes on the sidewalks. Neighbors waved from their front porches. It was everything I had worked my entire adult life to achieve. For 5 long years, I saved every penny I could. I worked double shifts at the manufacturing plant. I skipped vacations and ate lunch from home every single day. My wife Sarah picked up weekend shifts at the hospital where she worked as a nurse. We both had one goal in mind. We wanted to build a pool in our backyard. Not just any pool. We wanted our dream pool, something our kids would remember for the rest of their lives, a place where we could host family barbecues and watch our children learn to swim. We researched every detail. We wanted a kidney-shaped pool with a shallow end for the little ones and a deep end for diving. We planned for underwater lighting and a waterfall feature. We even designed a stone patio around the entire perimeter. Getting the permits took 6 months. The city inspectors came out 4 different times. We had to submit soil tests, engineering reports, and detailed construction plans. Every step cost money, but we did everything by the book. We were not about to cut corners on something this important. Construction began in March of 2021. Every day after work, I would stand in my backyard and watch the progress. First came the excavation, then the steel reinforcement, then the concrete. Slowly but surely, our dream was taking shape right before our eyes. The pool was completed in June. That first day when we filled it with water, I felt tears in my eyes. Sarah grabbed my hand and squeezed it tight. Our 8-year-old daughter Emma and 6-year-old son Jake were practically bouncing with excitement. "Can we swim now, Dad? Can we swim now?" Jake kept asking. The next 3 months were the happiest of my life. Every weekend brought pool parties. Our extended family came over for barbecues. The kids invited their friends from school. Sarah and I would sit on the patio in the evenings, watching the underwater lights shimmer and listening to the gentle hum of the filter system. The neighborhood seemed to love it too. Our next-door neighbor, Mrs. Chen, would wave from her kitchen window while we swam. The family across the street, the Johnsons, often stopped by to admire our handiwork. Even the mail carrier, Pete, would pause to chat about how beautiful the pool looked. I knew we had a homeowners association. Every house in Maple Ridge Estates was part of it. We got monthly newsletters about community events and maintenance schedules. The dues were reasonable, $50 per month. The HOA maintained the common areas, organized the annual block party, and handled snow removal on the main streets. It seemed like a fair trade. The HOA president was a woman named Margaret Stevens. She lived in the largest house at the end of Cherry Lane. I had seen her at a few community meetings, but we had never really spoken. She seemed professional and organized. Nothing about her raised any red flags. That all changed on a Tuesday morning in September. I was getting ready for work when I heard the mail truck pull up to our mailbox. I grabbed my coffee and walked outside to collect the mail. Bills, advertisements, the usual stuff. But there was one envelope that stood out. It was thick and official looking. The return address read, Maple Ridge Estates Homeowners Association. I tore it open right there on the sidewalk, expecting maybe an invitation to the fall festival or a notice about leaf pickup schedules. Instead, I found a violation notice that would turn my dream into a nightmare. My hands trembled as I read the letter, not from fear, but from pure disbelief. The violation notice was 3 pages long and typed in the most official-sounding language I had ever seen. But the substance of it was absolutely absurd. Dear Mr. Davidson, it began. The Maple Ridge Estates Homeowners Association Board has conducted an inspection of your property and has identified the following violations of our community standards. Violation number 1. Pool visibility from street. According to the notice, my pool was too visible from the public sidewalk and therefore violated the community aesthetic standards. I looked back at my pool. You could barely see a corner of it from the street, and only if you were standing in exactly the right spot. Violation number 2. Unapproved pool color. The water in my pool was apparently the wrong shade of blue. I read that line 5 times to make sure I was not imagining it. They were fining me because my pool water was not the correct color blue. Violation number 3. Landscaping disruption. The construction of the pool had supposedly damaged the visual harmony of the neighborhood landscaping. This was completely ridiculous. We had hired a professional landscaping company to restore everything after construction. Our yard looked better than it had before we started. Each violation carried a fine of $250, $750 total, and I had 30 days to remedy the violations or face additional penalties. I stood in my driveway, staring at this piece of paper, feeling like I had just been punched in the stomach. This had to be some kind of mistake. There was no way the HOA could seriously expect me to pay $750 for having a pool that was the wrong color blue. I called the HOA office immediately. The phone rang 6 times before a woman answered. Maple Ridge HOA, this is Linda. Hi Linda, this is David Davidson on Oak Street. I just received a violation notice about my pool, and I think there might be some kind of error. Hold on, let me pull up your file. I heard typing in the background. Yes, Mr. Davidson, I see the notice here. What questions do you have? Well, all of them, actually. This says my pool is too visible from the street, but you can barely see it. And it says the water is the wrong color. I do not understand what that even means. Mr. Davidson, the board has determined that your pool installation violates multiple community standards. If you would like to dispute these findings, you can request a hearing. How do I do that? You need to submit a written request along with a $50 processing fee. The hearing will be scheduled within 60 days. $50 just to ask them to reconsider their obviously wrong decision. This was getting worse by the minute. I spent the next hour writing an email to Margaret Stevens. I kept it polite and professional. I explained that I had followed all city regulations and obtained proper permits. I pointed out that many other pools in the neighborhood were equally visible from the street. I asked for a reasonable explanation of what unapproved pool color actually meant. Her response came back the same day. It was cold and dismissive. Mr. Davidson, the HOA board has conducted a thorough review of your property modifications. The violations stand as written. You have 26 days remaining to bring your property into compliance. That was it. No explanation. No willingness to discuss the matter, just a bureaucratic brush-off. I decided to do some research. I dug out my HOA agreement from the filing cabinet and read through every page. The rules about pools were vague and open to interpretation. Words like harmonious, appropriate, and community standards appeared throughout, but there were no specific measurements or color requirements. Then I started walking around the neighborhood, really looking at other people's pools. The Hendersons had a pool that was much more visible from the street than mine. The Martinez family had a bright turquoise pool that was definitely a different shade of blue than mine. The Patel family had an above-ground pool that stuck up 4 feet higher than anything else in their backyard. None of them had violation notices taped to their doors. I called Mrs. Chen, my next-door neighbor. She was in her 70s and had lived in the neighborhood longer than anyone. Mrs. Chen, have you ever received any violation notices from the HOA? She was quiet for a moment. David, can I call you back in a few minutes? 20 minutes later, my phone rang. I had to wait for my husband to leave for his doctor's appointment, she whispered. Yes, we have received notices. 3 of them in the past 2 years. They said our mailbox was the wrong color. They said we planted the wrong type of flowers. They said our porch light was too bright. What did you do? We paid the fines. We were too scared to fight them. David, that Margaret woman is not someone you want to cross. She has made life very difficult for people who have tried to stand up to her. That night I could not sleep. I kept thinking about Mrs. Chen's words. I thought about the $750 they wanted me to pay for violations that made no sense. I thought about the smug tone in Margaret's email. By morning I had made a decision. I was not going to pay these fines. I was going to fight back. Fighting back turned out to be much harder than I expected, and much more expensive. 2 weeks after I submitted my written dispute, I received another letter from the HOA. This one was even thicker than the first. They had found 5 additional violations on my property. My mailbox was apparently 6 inches too far from the street. My garden hose was visible from the sidewalk. My trash cans were not stored in the designated location, even though I put them in the same spot every Tuesday for 3 years. Each new violation carried another $250 fine. The total was now $2,000. I hired a lawyer. Janet Morrison specialized in HOA disputes, and her initial consultation fee was $300. She reviewed all my documents and shook her head. David, you are dealing with a very aggressive board. These violations are questionable at best, but fighting them through the legal system is going to be expensive. We are talking about $5,000 to $10,000 in legal fees minimum. But they are wrong. These violations are completely made up. Being right and winning in court are 2 different things. HOAs have a lot of legal power, and they know most homeowners cannot afford to fight them. I decided to fight anyway. Janet filed formal challenges to each violation. The HOA responded by scheduling surprise inspections of my property. They would show up unannounced with clipboards and cameras, measuring everything from the height of my grass to the distance between my sprinkler heads. The stress was destroying my family. Sarah and I started arguing about money every night. The kids could sense the tension. Emma asked me why the mean lady kept coming to our house with her clipboard. I did not know what to tell her. The HOA meetings became a nightmare. Margaret would sit at the head table with her smug smile, reading off violation after violation like she was announcing sports scores. Other homeowners would avoid eye contact with me. I could tell they were scared of becoming the next target. But some people started reaching out to me privately. Tom Johnson from across the street called me one evening. "David, I want you to know that what they are doing to you is wrong. Last year, they came after us for having the wrong color mailbox flag. We paid the fine because we could not afford to fight it." More stories emerged. The elderly couple on Elm Street had been fined for having a garden gnome in their front yard. The single mother on Pine Street had been charged for having toys visible in her driveway. The retired teacher on Maple Avenue had been cited for having an inappropriate welcome mat. Margaret was running the HOA like her personal kingdom. She decided what was appropriate and what was not. She determined who got violation notices and who got left alone, and she was making a lot of money doing it. The violation notices kept coming. By Christmas, I owed the HOA $4,000 in fines. My legal bills had reached $6,000. We had to take out a second mortgage on our house to pay for the fight. Sarah finally broke down one night in December. She was sitting at the kitchen table, staring at a stack of bills and violation notices. Tears were streaming down her face. "David, we cannot keep doing this. We are going to lose our house. We are going to lose everything." I sat down next to her and took her hand. "I know this is hard, but if we give up now, they win. They will keep doing this to other families. Someone has to stand up to them." "But why does it have to be us? Why do we have to be the ones to sacrifice everything?" I did not have a good answer for that. All I knew was that paying the fines would not make the problem go away. Margaret had tasted blood. She would keep coming after us no matter what we did. That night, lying awake in bed, I realized something important. Fighting fair was not working. Playing by their rules was a losing strategy. Margaret and her HOA board had rigged the game from the beginning. They had all the power, all the money, and all the legal advantages. If I was going to win this war, I needed to stop thinking like a victim and start thinking like a strategist. I needed to find their weakness and exploit it. I needed to turn their own weapons against them. I needed to change the rules of the game entirely. The next morning, I called Janet Morrison and told her to put all legal proceedings on hold. I had a different plan. She tried to talk me out of it, but I had made up my mind. It was time to go on the offensive. I started my investigation the same way any good detective would. I followed the money. Every HOA has to file financial reports with the state. These documents are public record, available to anyone who knows where to look. I spent my first Saturday morning at the county courthouse, digging through filing cabinets and requesting copies of everything related to Maple Ridge Estates. What I found was disturbing. The HOA collected about $30,000 per year in dues from the 120 homes in our neighborhood. But they were also generating another $15,000 annually in violation fines. Margaret had turned harassment into a profit center. Even more interesting was how that money was being spent. The landscaping contract went to a company called Stevens Lawn Care. The snow removal contract went to Stevens Property Services. The newsletter printing was handled by Stevens Marketing Solutions. All three companies had the same business address. All three were owned by the same person, Margaret Stevens. She was awarding HOA contracts to her own companies and paying herself with our money. It was a classic conflict of interest, and in most states, it was illegal. I kept digging. Property records, business licenses, tax filings. I was learning more about Margaret Stevens than she probably wanted anyone to know. She had been involved in HOA disputes before. In her previous neighborhood, she had been sued by 17 different homeowners for harassment and selective enforcement. The case had been settled out of court, and she had moved to Maple Ridge Estates shortly afterward. She was also having financial problems. Her landscaping business had several liens against it for unpaid bills. Her mortgage was 3 months behind. The violation fines she was collecting from our neighborhood were probably the only thing keeping her afloat financially. But the most important discovery came from the county property records office. I was researching the legal boundaries of our neighborhood when I stumbled across something that made my heart race. The common areas in Maple Ridge Estates were not owned by the HOA. They were owned by something called Ridge Development Corporation, which had apparently gone out of business in 2018. The land had been abandoned by the original developer and was sitting in legal limbo. This was huge. The pool that Margaret used every day for her morning laps was not on HOA property. The tennis court where she played twice a week was not on HOA property. The playground where she brought her grandchildren was not on HOA property. None of it belonged to the HOA. It was all owned by a defunct corporation, which meant it could potentially be purchased by anyone willing to pay the back taxes and legal fees. I made copies of everything and drove straight to Janet Morrison's office. "David, this is very interesting, but I am not sure how it helps with your violation notices." "Janet, what if I told you I could buy the land that contains all the common areas in my neighborhood?" She looked up from the documents. "That would change everything. If you own the common areas, you would have the legal right to restrict access to them. Including the pool. Including the pool." That night, I called an emergency meeting in my living room. I invited Tom Johnson, Mrs. Chen, the Martinez family, and 3 other homeowners who had been targeted by Margaret's violation campaigns. I spread the property records across my coffee table and explained what I had discovered. The room was silent for a long moment. Finally, Tom spoke up. "David, are you saying you want to buy the entire common area?" "I am saying we should explore the possibility. If we can pool our resources and purchase this land, we can take control away from Margaret. We can make our own rules." Mrs. Chen leaned forward. "How much would something like that cost?" "I do not know yet, but it has to be less than what we are all spending on legal fees and fines." The Martinez family offered to contribute $5,000. The Johnsons pledged $3,000. Mrs. Chen surprised everyone by offering $10,000. Within an hour, we had commitments for over $30,000. But I knew this was not just about money. This was about strategy. If we were going to make this work, we needed to be smart, careful, and completely secret. Margaret could not find out what we were planning until it was too late for her to stop it. Over the next month, I became an expert in property law, tax liens, and corporate dissolution. I researched every detail of Ridge Development Corporation's bankruptcy. I studied the legal requirements for purchasing abandoned property. I learned about adverse possession, eminent domain, and mineral rights. Most importantly, I found a lawyer who specialized in exactly this type of transaction. His name was Robert Chen, and he happened to be Mrs. Chen's nephew. He worked for a firm in the city that handled complex real estate deals. "David, what you are proposing is definitely possible," Robert told me during our first meeting. "But it is going to take time, and it needs to be done very carefully. If the current HOA board finds out what you are planning, they could try to block the sale." "How long are we talking about?" 4 to 6 months, assuming everything goes smoothly." "And how much will it cost?" "For the land, probably 15 to 20,000 in back taxes and fees. For the legal work, another 10,000. You are looking at around $30,000 total." It was a lot of money, but it was less than what I had already spent fighting Margaret in court, and if it worked, it would give us the power to end her reign of terror permanently. That night I looked out at my pool from the kitchen window. The underwater lights were glowing softly in the darkness. Sarah was reading in bed upstairs. The kids were asleep. In 6 months, everything could be different. In 6 months, I could own the very pool that Margaret used for her morning laps. I could control access to every common area in the neighborhood. In 6 months, I could turn the tables completely. The next 6 months were the most stressful and exciting of my life. Every day felt like walking a tightrope. One wrong move, one leaked conversation, one suspicious phone call could blow our entire operation. Robert Chen had put together a team of specialists, a property lawyer, a tax attorney, and a forensic accountant. They worked in complete secrecy, communicating through encrypted email and meeting only in Robert's downtown office. The legal process was more complicated than I had imagined. Ridge Development Corporation had been dissolved, but the property had not been properly transferred to the state. It was caught in a legal gray area that required multiple court filings and bureaucratic procedures. We had to file a petition with the county court to claim abandoned property. We had to publish legal notices in the newspaper for 3 consecutive weeks. We had to notify all potential creditors of the defunct corporation. Every step had to be perfect, or the entire plan would fall apart. Meanwhile, I had to act completely normal around Margaret and the HOA board. When violation notices arrived in my mailbox, I responded with the same frustrated emails as before. When they scheduled property inspections, I complained loudly about harassment and overreach. The hardest part was the HOA meetings. Sitting in that community center, listening to Margaret read off violation after violation, knowing that in a few months she would be powerless to enforce any of it. I had to bite my tongue and play the role of the defeated homeowner. But there were close calls. In February, Margaret cornered me after a meeting. "David, you have been awfully quiet lately. Usually you have more to say about the board's decisions." My heart was pounding, but I kept my voice steady. "Margaret, I am tired of fighting. My lawyer says it is costing me more to dispute the violations than it would cost to just pay them." She smiled that smug smile I had grown to hate. "I am glad you are finally seeing reason. The sooner you accept that the board knows what is best for this community, the sooner we can put this unpleasantness behind us." In March, we hit our first major obstacle. The forensic accountant discovered that Ridge Development Corporation had one remaining creditor. A construction company in Florida was claiming they were owed $80,000 for work done on the original development. If their claim was valid, they could block our purchase of the property. Robert's team spent 3 weeks investigating the claim and discovered it was fraudulent. The construction company had been dissolved 5 years ago, and the person filing the claim was using fake documents. We filed a motion to dismiss the fraudulent claim, but it delayed our timeline by 6 weeks. In April, Margaret escalated her campaign against me. She started filing violation reports with the city building department, claiming that my pool had been built without proper permits. I had to spend 2 days at City Hall with my original permit documents, proving that everything had been done legally. She also convinced 2 of my neighbors to file noise complaints about our pool filter system. The police showed up at my house 3 times to investigate noise violations. Each time, they measured the sound levels and determined that our equipment was well within legal limits. The stress was affecting my entire family. Sarah had developed insomnia. Emma's grades were slipping at school. Jake had started having nightmares about the mean lady taking away our pool. But our secret group was growing stronger. Word had spread quietly through the neighborhood about what we were trying to do. More families offered financial support. The Patels contributed $2,000. The retired teacher on Maple Avenue pledged $5,000. By May, we had raised over $50,000 from 17 different families. Everyone was tired of living under Margaret's dictatorship. Everyone wanted their neighborhood back. The final court hearing was scheduled for June 15th. This was the moment when a judge would either approve our petition to purchase the abandoned property or reject it entirely. If we won, the land would be transferred to our newly formed corporation, Maple Ridge Property Holdings. If we lost, everything we had worked for would be gone. Robert warned me that Margaret's lawyers might try to intervene at the last minute. They could claim that the HOA had some legal right to the common areas, even though they had never actually owned them. The night before the hearing, I could not sleep. I kept thinking about everything that had led to this moment. The violation notices, the legal bills, the stress on my family, the neighbors who had been bullied into silence. Tomorrow, either we would strike back at the system that had tried to crush us, or we would be defeated by it completely. I walked outside and stood by my pool. The water was perfectly clear and blue, the same blue that Margaret had fined me for months ago. The underwater lights created dancing patterns on the surface. In 12 hours, I would either own the land that the community pool sat on, or I would be back to fighting violation notices and harassment campaigns. But I was not scared anymore. I was ready. The county courthouse was packed when I arrived at 9 a.m. Robert Chen was waiting for me in the hallway with a thick folder of documents. He looked nervous but confident. "David, the judge should make her decision within an hour. If everything goes according to plan, you will own 15 acres of prime real estate by lunchtime." The hearing itself was surprisingly brief. Robert presented our petition, the financial documents, and the proof that we had followed all legal requirements. The judge asked a few clarifying questions, reviewed the paperwork, and announced her decision. The petition is approved. The property formerly owned by Ridge Development Corporation is hereby transferred to Maple Ridge Property Holdings, Incorporated. That was it, we owned the land. But the real confrontation was still ahead of me. The monthly HOA meeting was scheduled for 7 p.m. that same evening. Margaret had no idea what was coming. I spent the afternoon preparing. Robert had given me copies of all the property deeds, transfer documents, and legal papers. I also had a folder full of evidence about Margaret's financial conflicts of interest and selective enforcement practices. The community center was more crowded than usual. Word had somehow spread that something big was going to happen. Margaret sat at her usual spot at the head table, shuffling through her stack of violation notices. She started the meeting with her standard speech about maintaining community standards and property values. Then she began reading off the latest violations. My name was called first. David Davidson, 1247 Oak Street. Failure to maintain approved lawn height. Fine of $250. Failure to store garden tools in designated area. Fine of $250. I stood up slowly. The room went completely quiet. Margaret, before you continue, I have an announcement that I think everyone will find interesting. Her face flushed red. Mr. Davidson, you are out of order. Please sit down. Actually, Margaret, I am not out of order. You see, as of this morning at 10:15 a.m., I became the legal owner of all common areas in this neighborhood. The room erupted. People were talking, shouting, asking questions. Margaret was banging her gavel, demanding order. That is impossible, she shouted over the noise. The HOA owns those areas. I opened my folder and pulled out the property deed. Actually, Margaret, the HOA has never owned these areas. They were owned by Ridge Development Corporation, which went out of business in 2018. This morning, I purchased the abandoned property through the county court system. I walked to the front of the room and placed the deed on the table in front of her. Her hands were shaking as she read through it. This cannot be legal. I am going to have our lawyers look into this immediately. Please do. But I should mention that I also have documentation showing that you have been awarding HOA contracts to companies that you own. That is a clear conflict of interest and probably illegal. I pulled out the business registration documents showing that Stevens Lawn Care, Stevens Property Services, and Stevens Marketing Solutions were all owned by Margaret Stevens. The room was dead silent now. Everyone was staring at Margaret, waiting for her response. Those contracts were awarded through a competitive bidding process, she stammered. Really? Because I have copies of your financial records showing that you never solicited other bids. You just awarded the contracts to yourself and paid yourself with HOA money. Tom Johnson stood up from the back of the room. Margaret, is this true? Have you been stealing from us? Other voices joined in. How much money are we talking about? How long has this been going on? What else have you been hiding? Margaret was completely flustered. She kept looking around the room like she was searching for an escape route. I demand that this meeting be adjourned, she said, gathering up her papers. Actually, Margaret, since I now own the building we are meeting in, I get to decide when this meeting ends. That was not technically true. The community center was still owned by the city, but the psychological impact was devastating. Margaret looked like she had been slapped. Now, I continued, let me explain how things are going to work going forward. Effective immediately, I am implementing new rules for the use of the common areas. I pulled out a prepared statement and began reading. First, the community pool will be open to all residents of Maple Ridge Estates, except for members of the current HOA board. The crowd erupted again, but this time with cheers and applause. Second, all existing violation fines are hereby forgiven. No resident will be required to pay any outstanding penalties. More cheers. Third, any HOA board member who wishes to use the common areas must submit a written request and pay a daily use fee of $50. Margaret was turning purple. You cannot do this. We have legal rights. We have contracts. Actually, Margaret, you do not have any rights to property that you do not own. And as for contracts, I think we need to have a serious discussion about fraud and embezzlement. Mrs. Chen stood up from the middle of the room. David, what happens to the HOA now? The HOA can continue to exist if residents want it to, but it will no longer control access to the pool, tennis court, or playground. Those areas are now under new management. I looked directly at Margaret, and that management does not tolerate bullying, harassment, or selective enforcement. Margaret grabbed her purse and headed for the door. "This is not over, David. My lawyers will be in touch." "I look forward to hearing from them," I called after her. "Make sure they bring documentation showing how you justified awarding HOA contracts to companies that you own." She slammed the door behind her. The room stayed quiet for a moment, and then someone started clapping. Soon, the entire room was applauding. Tom Johnson walked up to me and shook my hand. "David, I do not know how you pulled this off, but you just saved our neighborhood." Mrs. Chen had tears in her eyes. "I have not felt this free in my own home for 3 years." The celebration lasted until almost 10 p.m. People were sharing stories about Margaret's harassment campaigns. Others were making plans for neighborhood barbecues and pool parties without fear of violation notices. As I drove home that night, I realized that the war was not completely over. Margaret would probably try to fight back through the legal system, but the balance of power had shifted dramatically. For the first time in 3 years, I was not the one being threatened with fines and legal action. Now I was the one making the rules. The transformation of Maple Ridge Estates was immediate and dramatic. Within a week of the confrontation, Margaret Stevens had resigned from the HOA board and put her house up for sale. Her lawyers never called. Her threats of legal action never materialized. She simply disappeared from our lives as quickly as she had entered them. The other board members who had enabled her behavior also stepped down. Patricia Webb, who had rubber-stamped every violation notice, moved to Florida to live with her daughter. Bill Morrison, who had conducted those harassment inspections, suddenly became very interested in staying out of neighborhood politics. I found myself in the unusual position of being a property owner with real power in the community. But I was determined not to become the kind of petty tyrant that Margaret had been. My first decision was to establish reasonable rules for the common areas. No harassment, no arbitrary fines, no selective enforcement. The pool would be open from dawn to dusk. Families could host birthday parties and barbecues with advance notice. Children could play without fear of violation notices. The tennis court that had been reserved for Margaret's exclusive use 3 mornings per week was now available on a first-come, first-served basis. The playground that had been subjected to weekly safety inspections was simply allowed to be a place where kids could have fun. But the sweetest moment came 3 weeks after the confrontation. I was floating in my pool on a Saturday afternoon when I heard a car pull into the driveway across the street. Margaret had come back to collect some belongings from her house. She stood at the edge of her property, staring at my pool. The same pool she had tried to find me for. The same pool she had claimed violated community standards. The same pool she was now legally banned from using. I waved at her from my pool float. She got back in her car and drove away. I never saw her again. The financial impact of owning the common areas turned out to be surprisingly manageable. The 17 families who had contributed to the purchase became founding members of Maple Ridge Property Holdings. We split the ongoing maintenance costs, which were actually lower than what we had been paying in HOA dues and legal fees. More importantly, we discovered that Margaret had been wildly overcharging for maintenance services. Her landscaping company had been billing the HOA $1,500 per month for lawn care that we were able to get done for $600. Her snow removal service had been charging triple the market rate. The neighborhood culture changed completely. Kids started riding bikes on the sidewalks again, without parents worrying about traffic pattern violations. Families began hosting front yard barbecues without fear of noise complaints. People started talking to each other instead of avoiding eye contact at the mailbox. Mrs. Chen planted a flower garden that would have resulted in multiple violation notices under